The power went out at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and I watched my father's medical equipment flicker before the backup battery kicked in, knowing we had maybe 6 hours before things got critical. My name is Ethan Quinn, and I live in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision in Columbus, Ohio, taking care of my 73-year-old father who requires 24-hour oxygen support and a specialized nebulizer for his chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The house I inherited from my late mother came with its own special burden. The Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, currently presided over by Patricia Henderson, a woman who had made it her personal mission to ensure every resident lived in perfect compliance with the 67-page rule book she had personally expanded from the original 12 pages. I had been sitting in my home office, reviewing quarterly reports for my remote accounting job, when the lights went out. Columbus Edison sent an alert to my phone within minutes. Severe ice storm had taken down power lines across 3 neighborhoods. Estimated restoration time 8 to 12 hours. I immediately went to check on Dad in his room, where he sat propped up in his adjustable bed, the oxygen concentrator humming on its backup battery. "We're going to be fine," I told him, watching his weathered face crease with concern. "I have the portable generator in the garage, and the space heater setup we arranged with Dr. Morrison. 3 months ago, after a close call with a different outage, Dad's pulmonologist doctor, Morrison had prescribed a specific medical-grade space heater system that maintained optimal temperature and humidity levels in his room. Cold air was dangerous for Dad. His lungs couldn't handle the stress of breathing frigid air during winter months. The prescription had been explicit: maintain room temperature between 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity levels between 40 and 60%. The space heater I purchased was designed specifically for medical environments, with built-in sensors that regulated both temperature and humidity, while also powering a backup system for his nebulizer through an integrated power strip. I had filed all the proper paperwork with the HOA, submitted the medical documentation, received written approval from the previous HOA president, and kept everything in a well-organized folder. When Patricia took over in January, she had sent a mass email announcing a complete review and update of all previously approved exceptions and modifications. I grabbed my warmest jacket and headed to the garage, where my portable generator sat ready. I had tested it just 2 weeks ago, keeping it maintained and fueled for exactly this kind of emergency. The generator roared to life on the second pull, and I carefully ran the heavy-duty extension cord through the basement window, up through the interior, and into Dad's room. Within 20 minutes, I had his oxygen concentrator, nebulizer, and the medical space heater all running smoothly. The room temperature had already dropped to 64 degrees, and Dad had started coughing, that wet, rattling sound that always preceded serious breathing problems. "Try to rest," I said, adjusting his pillows. "Everything's up and running now. I'm going to make some soup on the camping stove." Dad nodded, his breathing already easier as warm air began circulating from the space heater. I checked all the connections twice, made sure the generator had plenty of fuel, and headed to the kitchen to figure out food for the duration of the outage. I was opening a can of chicken noodle soup when I heard the knock at my door, sharp and aggressive, the kind of knock that meant trouble. I set down the can opener and walked through my dark living room to the front door, where I could see Patricia Henderson through the window, bundled in a purple parka that matched her purple scarf, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. I opened the door to a blast of cold air and Patricia's piercing voice. "Mr. Quinn, I can hear your generator from my house 3 doors down. You are in violation of Community Noise Ordinances Section 12.4. Patricia, we're in a power outage, I said, trying to keep my voice level. My father needs his medical equipment running. I have all the documentation. I don't care what documentation you think you have, she interrupted, her face already turning red despite the cold. The previous administration was far too lenient with exceptions. I've been going door to door ensuring all residents comply with emergency protocols. Generators are only permitted in the backyard, at least 50 feet from any property line, with noise-dampening enclosures. It's an ice storm, Patricia. I can't safely move a running generator in these conditions, and I need to monitor it because my father's life depends on it staying operational. I'll be happy to review any new requirements once power is restored, but right now, you're disturbing the entire neighborhood, she said, pulling out her phone. I'm documenting this violation. You have 30 minutes to relocate the generator or shut it down. Those are your options. My father has copped, I said, feeling my patience slip. His medical equipment requires continuous power. The space heater in his room is part of his prescribed medical treatment. I'm not shutting anything down. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Space heater. You're running a space heater during a power outage. That's a direct violation of Section 18.7, Emergency Fire Hazards. Space heaters are explicitly banned during power outages due to increased fire risk when residents aren't able to monitor them properly. It's medical equipment, I repeated. I have a prescription from his doctor. It's not a regular space heater. It's a medical device that maintains necessary environmental conditions for his respiratory condition. A space heater is a space heater, Patricia said firmly. I'm going to need you to surrender it immediately. I'll hold it at my house until power is restored. Then you can file a formal appeal for its return once we review your supposed documentation. I actually laughed, a short, incredulous sound. You want me to give you my father's medical equipment during a power outage? Are you serious? I am absolutely serious. As HOA president, I have the authority to confiscate any items that pose a safety risk to the community. If you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to contact the authorities and have them enforce the community covenants. Call whoever you want, I said, starting to close the door. I'm not giving you medical equipment that's keeping my father alive. Patricia stuck her foot in the doorway. Mr. Quinn, I'm trying to be reasonable here. The safety of this entire neighborhood is my responsibility. House fires during power outages are a leading cause of property damage and death. I cannot allow you to endanger your neighbors because of your stubborn refusal to follow clearly established rules. My father needs that equipment, I said, my voice rising. The generator is safe. I'm monitoring it constantly, and the space heater is designed for medical use. Now please remove your foot from my door. I'll be back with the police, Patricia said, stepping back. And don't think I won't. I have the community covenants on my side, and you signed them when you inherited this property. She turned and marched back down my icy driveway, nearly slipping twice, her phone already pressed to her ear. I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. I had dealt with Patricia's aggressive HOA enforcement before. Parking tickets for leaving my trash can out 45 minutes too long. Citations for having grass that exceeded the permitted height by half an inch. Warnings about the wrong shade of white paint on my shutters. But this was different. This was my father's health, potentially his life. I checked on Dad again, who had dozed off with the oxygen cannula in place, his breathing steady and unlabored. The room was back up to 72 degrees, the humidity gauge reading 55%. Everything was working exactly as it should. I took photos of all the equipment, the prescription label on the space heater, the medical documentation folder, everything I might need if this actually escalated. 40 minutes later, I heard vehicles outside. Through the window, I saw a Columbus police cruiser pull up, followed by Patricia's silver Lexus SUV. Two officers got out of the cruiser, and Patricia climbed out of her vehicle clutching a thick binder, presumably her precious HOA covenants. I opened the door before they could knock. The officers looked cold and tired, probably responding to actual emergencies all day. The older one, with gray hair visible under his police cap, spoke first. "Mr. Quinn, I'm Officer Davis. This is Officer Chen. We received a call about HOA violations and a potential safety hazard." "There's no safety hazard," I said. "I'm running a generator to power my father's medical equipment during the outage. Everything is being properly monitored and maintained." Patricia pushed forward. "He's running an illegal space heater in violation of community fire safety codes. I need it confiscated immediately before he burns down the entire neighborhood." Officer Davis held up a hand. "Madam, please. Mr. Quinn, can we come in and take a look at the situation?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside. Patricia tried to follow, but Officer Chen politely blocked her path. "Just the officers, madam. Please wait here." I led them through my house to Dad's room, explaining the medical situation as we walked. Dad had woken up when he heard voices, looking confused and worried. I introduced the officers and showed them the medical equipment setup. Officer Davis examined the space heater carefully, noting the medical device label, the prescription information attached to it, and the sophisticated control panel that clearly distinguished it from a regular space heater. He pulled out his phone and took several photos, then looked at the oxygen concentrator and nebulizer. "Your father requires all this equipment?" he asked gently. "Yes, sir," I said. "He has severe COPD. The oxygen is continuous, the nebulizer is used 4 times daily, and the space heater maintains the environmental conditions his lungs need. Cold air causes his airways to constrict, which can be life-threatening given his condition. You have documentation of the medical necessity." I grabbed my folder and showed him everything: Dr. Morrison's prescription, the medical supply company's certification that the heater met medical device standards, my approved HOA exception from 6 months ago, and my father's hospital records from the last time his condition became critical. Officer Davis reviewed everything carefully, then showed it to Officer Chen. They stepped out of the room, and I followed them to the living room, where Patricia stood just inside my front door, having apparently ignored Officer Chen's instruction to wait outside. "The equipment appears to be legitimate medical devices," Officer Davis said, "and Mr. Quinn has substantial documentation supporting the medical necessity." "But the HOA covenants clearly state," Patricia began. "Madam, HOA covenants don't supersede medical necessity," Officer Chen said. "The Americans with Disabilities Act protects the rights of individuals to use necessary medical equipment in their homes. Even if your covenants ban space heaters outright, which I understand they don't, they do for emergencies, a medical exception would still apply." "So you're just going to let him endanger everyone?" Patricia's voice had gone shrill. "What about when his jury-rigged setup starts a fire?" "It's not jury-rigged," I said, trying to stay calm. "It's professional medical equipment properly installed and monitored. The generator is rated for this exact purpose, and I'm checking it every 30 minutes. Officer Davis turned to Patricia. "Madam, there's no violation here. Mr. Quinn is within his rights to operate necessary medical equipment. I'd suggest you leave him alone and let him care for his father." Patricia's face had gone bright red. "This is unacceptable. I have a responsibility to this community. If you won't enforce the covenants, I'll take matters into my own hands as I'm authorized to do." "What does that mean exactly?" Officer Chen asked, his tone sharpening. "It means I have the authority as HOA president to enter properties and confiscate items that pose community safety risks, as outlined in Section 23 of our covenants," Patricia said, clutching her binder. "If Mr. Quinn won't voluntarily surrender the space heater, I'll obtain it myself." "That would be trespassing and theft," Officer Davis said firmly. "And I'm telling you right now, don't do it. This man is caring for his disabled father with legitimate medical equipment. Leave him alone." "You'll be hearing from our HOA attorney," Patricia snapped at me. "This isn't over." She stormed out, and the officers exchanged a look that clearly said they'd dealt with HOA disputes before and found them exhausting. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate you coming out here and being reasonable about this." "Just keep doing what you're doing," Officer Davis said. "But I'd recommend you document everything, times, dates, interactions with her. If she continues harassing you, you may need to pursue a restraining order. We see a lot of HOA disputes, but this one seems particularly aggressive." They left, and I locked the door behind them, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. I checked on Dad again, gave him his evening medications, and made us both soup heated on the camping stove. The power company's estimated restoration time had been pushed back to midnight, then to 4 a.m., then to 8 a.m. the next day. The ice storm had been worse than predicted, with downed lines across the entire metro area. I refueled the generator at 6 p.m., again at 9 p.m., and settled into Dad's room with a book and a flashlight, monitoring all his equipment through the night. Dad slept fitfully, occasionally waking to cough or adjust his position. Each time, I checked his oxygen levels with the pulse oximeter and made sure all the equipment was functioning properly. At 2:15 a.m., I heard something outside. I got up quietly and looked out the window, seeing a figure in the backyard near my garage. My heart started pounding as I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight app, shining it out the window. The figure turned, and I saw Patricia's face, shocked and angry at being spotted. She was holding bolt cutters. I immediately called 911, reporting someone attempting to break into my garage. Then I went to the back door, turned on my phone's video camera, and opened it. "Patricia, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted. "Enforcing community standards," she said, not even trying to hide the bolt cutters. "You left me no choice. That space heater is coming with me right now." "I'm on with 911, I said, holding up my phone. "You're trespassing on my property with tools intended for theft." "I'm recording everything." "You can't intimidate me," Patricia said, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. "I have legal authority under the HOA covenants to remove safety hazards." "No, you don't," I said. "And now you're looking at criminal trespassing and attempted theft. I strongly suggest you leave my property immediately." Patricia stood there for another few seconds, then threw the bolt cutters down on my lawn and stalked off toward her house. I kept recording until she disappeared from view, then went back inside, shaking with anger and disbelief. The 911 operator had heard everything and confirmed police were on their way. Officers Davis and Chen arrived again, and this time they looked far less patient. I showed them the video I had recorded, the bolt cutters lying in my yard, and they went directly to Patricia's house. I watched from my window as she answered her door in a bathrobe, her face going pale when she saw the officers. The conversation lasted about 15 minutes, and when the officers came back to my house, Officer Davis was carrying a report. "We've issued her a citation for criminal trespassing," he said. She admitted to being in your yard, claimed she was there to inspect your generator setup for community safety, but the bolt cutters kind of undermine that story. We've advised her that any further contact with you constitutes harassment, and we recommended you file for a restraining order in the morning. I will, I said. Thank you for taking this seriously. Property disputes are civil matters, but this crossed into criminal behavior, Officer Chen said. She's lucky we're just citing her. The prosecutor might want to add attempted theft depending on how hard you want to push this. After they left, I sat in Dad's room, too wired to sleep, watching the medical equipment hum and beep, maintaining the environment that kept my father alive. The generator chugged along outside, burning through fuel but doing its job. I had never imagined that trying to keep my father healthy would result in midnight confrontations with bolt cutter wielding HOA presidents. Power came back at 6:32 a.m., the lights flickering on throughout the house. I carefully transitioned all of Dad's equipment back to main power, shut down the generator, and made coffee. Dad woke up around 7, looking better than he had in days, the uninterrupted night of proper oxygen and environmental conditions having done him good. Heard some commotion last night, he said, his voice rough. Everything okay? Just HOA nonsense, I said, not wanting to worry him with the details. Nothing we can't handle. I spent the morning documenting everything, printing out the videos I had recorded, organizing all my medical documentation, and researching restraining order procedures. At 9 a.m., I called my attorney, Robert Chen, a guy I had gone to college with who now practiced civil law in Columbus. So let me get this straight, Robert said after I explained the situation. The HOA president tried to confiscate your father's prescribed medical equipment, ignored police warnings, then trespassed on your property with bolt cutters in the middle of the night to steal it. That's accurate, I said. Ethan, this is insane. Even for HOA cases, and I've seen some crazy ones, this is next level. You need a restraining order immediately, and honestly, you should consider suing the HOA for harassment, emotional distress, and violation of the Fair Housing Act. Interfering with disability accommodations is serious. I just want her to leave us alone, I said. Dad doesn't need this stress. I understand, but you need to protect yourself. I can file for an emergency restraining order today, should have it by this afternoon. Then we'll schedule a hearing for a permanent order. Document everything, every interaction, every email, everything. This woman is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Robert filed the paperwork immediately, and by 3 p.m., I had a temporary restraining order requiring Patricia to stay at least 300 feet away from me, my father, and my property. I had it served that evening, and I won't lie. Watching the process server hand her the papers through my window gave me a small sense of satisfaction. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and according to the community covenants, any resident could attend and speak during the open comment period. Robert advised me to go, present my case to the full board, and establish a clear record of what had happened. He offered to come with me, and I accepted gratefully. The meeting was held at the Meadowbrook Hills Clubhouse, a dated building with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable folding chairs. About 30 residents were there, which was apparently high turnout. The board consisted of Patricia as president, Doug Martinez as vice president, Linda Kowalski as treasurer, and 2 other members I didn't know well. They sat at a long table at the front of the room, Patricia in the center, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. When the meeting opened to public comments, I stood up and Robert stood with me. Patricia's face went white. For the record, I'm Ethan Quinn, resident at 847 Maple Drive. With me is my attorney, Robert Chen. I'm here to address the recent actions taken by President Henderson regarding my father's medical equipment during last week's power outage. I proceeded to lay out everything that had happened, the initial confrontation, Patricia's demand to confiscate medical equipment, the police visits, and finally, her nighttime trespassing with bolt cutters. I showed the board copies of all my documentation, the medical prescriptions, Dr. Morrison's letters, the police reports, and the restraining order. Several residents gasped at various points, particularly when I showed the video of Patricia with the bolt cutters. My father is a 73-year-old man with severe respiratory disease, I said, my voice steady. He requires continuous medical support. The equipment I operate is prescribed by his physician and protected under federal law. President Henderson's actions weren't just harassment, they were potentially life-threatening. If she had succeeded in taking that space heater, my father could have gone into respiratory distress and died. Patricia tried to interrupt several times, but Doug Martinez, the vice president, kept shutting her down. When I finished, he asked if he could see all my documentation. I handed it over, and he reviewed it carefully, passing pages to the other board members. Mrs. Henderson, Doug said slowly, did you actually attempt to enter Mr. Quinn's property with bolt cutters? I was exercising my authority as HOA president to protect the community, Patricia said, her voice defensive. The covenants clearly grant me the right to address safety hazards. They absolutely do not grant you the right to trespass on private property or attempt to steal medical equipment, Linda Kowalski said, her voice sharp. I've been on this board for 6 years, and I've never seen anything like this. You could have killed his father. I was protecting the neighborhood from fire hazards, Patricia insisted. Space heaters during power outages are explicitly banned. Medical equipment isn't banned, Doug said, holding up Dr. Morrison's prescription. This documentation is thorough and legitimate. You had no authority to confiscate it, and frankly, I'm shocked you thought you did. Another board member, an older man named Frank something, spoke up. I move that we immediately revoke any and all HOA actions taken against Mr. Quinn regarding this matter. Furthermore, I move that we formally apologize on behalf of the HOA and ensure him that he has full approval to operate necessary medical equipment without interference. Seconded, Linda said immediately. We can't just, Patricia started, all in favor. Doug asked, and every hand except Patricia's went up. Motion carries. Mr. Quinn, on behalf of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, I apologize for what you and your father have endured. You have the board's full support to operate your father's medical equipment as prescribed. I'm not done with this, Patricia said, standing up abruptly. I'll be calling our HOA attorney tomorrow. You're all overstepping your authority. Actually, Patricia, I think we need to discuss your continued role as president, Linda said. Your actions have exposed this HOA to serious legal liability. You were cited by police for criminal trespassing. You attempted to confiscate medical equipment. You violated federal disability accommodation laws. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence. The room went silent. Patricia looked around at the other board members, seeing no support in their faces. You can't do this, she said. I was elected to this position. And the board can remove you for cause, Doug said quietly. Linda's right. You've created a liability nightmare. I second the motion. The vote was 4-1, with only Patricia voting against. Effective immediately, she was removed as HOA president, and Doug was appointed interim president. Patricia grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the clubhouse door so hard it rattled in its frame. After the meeting, Several residents approached me to express their support and share their own stories of Patricia's aggressive enforcement. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had been harassed over minor violations. One woman had been fined $500 because her mailbox was an unauthorized shade of black. Another family had been threatened with liens because their children's outdoor toys were visible from the street. The stories kept coming, painting a picture of an HOA president who had let a tiny amount of power go completely to her head. Robert pulled me aside as people were leaving. "That went well, but I need to warn you, she's not going to let this go. People like her, they don't handle being publicly challenged and removed from power. Keep your documentation handy, keep your security cameras running, and call me if she violates the restraining order even once." He was right to warn me. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from Patricia's attorney, a threatening piece of legal theater that demanded I pay for damages to community safety and well-being, and accused me of filing false police reports. Robert responded with his own letter, outlining every law Patricia had broken and suggesting that her attorney advise her client to cease all contact before we pursued civil action. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Dad was having a good day, so I arranged for a home health aide to stay with him, and I went to the Franklin County Courthouse with Robert. Patricia was there with her attorney, a bored-looking man in an expensive suit who clearly wished he was somewhere else. The hearing lasted about 40 minutes. I presented all my evidence, the videos, the police reports, the medical documentation. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that she had been acting within her authority as HOA president, but the judge shut that down immediately. "Madam, even if your HOA covenants granted you inspection authority, which is questionable, they certainly don't grant you the right to confiscate legally prescribed medical equipment," Judge Williams said, looking at Patricia over her reading glasses. "And showing up at someone's home at 2 in the morning with bolt cutters. What were you thinking?" "I was trying to prevent a fire," Patricia said, but her voice had lost its conviction. "By committing criminal trespass and attempted theft," the judge said. "I'm granting the restraining order for 1 year, renewable if necessary. Mrs. Henderson, you are to have no contact with Mr. Quinn or his father, directly or through third parties. You are to stay at least 300 feet from his property at all times. Violation will result in immediate arrest for contempt. You understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Patricia said quietly. As we left the courthouse, Robert squeezed my shoulder. "That's that. If she comes near you again, call the police immediately. In the meantime, I'd recommend you start attending HOA board meetings regularly. Doug seems reasonable, but you want to make sure the new leadership knows they have oversight." I took his advice. The next board meeting revealed that Patricia had been involved in over 200 enforcement actions in her 3 months as president, compared to about 40 for the entire previous year. The board voted to review every one of them, and several were immediately reversed as overly aggressive or not actually violations at all. The woman with the wrong shade of black mailbox got her $500 back. The family with visible toys was cleared of all fines. Doug reached out to me privately and asked if I'd be willing to serve on a new HOA rules committee to review and simplify the community covenants. "We need someone who's been on the receiving end of HOA overreach," he said. "Someone who understands the difference between reasonable community standards and harassment." I agreed, and over the next 3 months, we cut the 67-page rule book down to 25 pages of actually reasonable guidelines. We eliminated the ridiculous provisions about exact paint shades and grass height measurements down to the half-inch. We added explicit protections for medical equipment and disability accommodations. We created an appeals process that didn't require hiring an attorney. The reformed covenants passed with overwhelming resident approval. Dad's health had its ups and downs, but the stress-free environment helped. No more surprise HOA inspections, no more threatening letters, no more feeling like we were living under surveillance. His pulmonologist noted the improvement at his next appointment, even asking what had changed. I gave him the abbreviated version, and Dr. Morrison shook his head in disbelief. I've written medical necessity letters for HOAs before, but I've never heard of one being this aggressive, he said. You did the right thing standing up to her. Patients like your father, stress can be as dangerous as the disease itself. I thought the Patricia situation was done, that the restraining order and her removal from the board would be the end of it. I was wrong. 6 months after the restraining order was issued, I received notice that Patricia was suing me personally for defamation, emotional distress, and damage to her reputation. According to her lawsuit, my statements at the board meeting and the subsequent publicity had caused her to lose her job as a manager at a local retail company and made her a pariah in the community. Robert read the lawsuit and actually laughed. This is frivolous. Everything you said at that meeting was true and documented. Truth is an absolute defense to defamation. She's going to lose and probably end up paying your attorney fees. He was right, but it still meant months of legal proceedings, depositions, and stress. Patricia's attorney deposed me, asking invasive questions about my father's medical conditions, trying to establish that the equipment wasn't really necessary, that I had exaggerated for sympathy. Robert objected to most of the questions, and the deposition ended with nothing gained for Patricia's case. When we deposed Patricia, she fell apart. She couldn't keep her story straight, alternating between claiming she had authority to confiscate the heater and claiming she had only intended to inspect it. When confronted with the video of her holding bolt cutters, she actually tried to argue that bolt cutters were a standard inspection tool. Her own attorney looked embarrassed. The case went to summary judgment, meaning the judge could rule without a trial if the facts were clear enough. Robert filed a motion arguing that no reasonable jury could find in Patricia's favor given the evidence, and 3 weeks later, Judge Williams agreed. She dismissed Patricia's lawsuit entirely and ordered her to pay my attorney fees, which totaled about $8,000. Can she appeal? I asked Robert after we got the ruling. She can try, but she won't win. The ruling is solid, and honestly, I don't think her attorney will continue representing her. He knows it's a losing case and she probably can't afford to keep paying him to pursue it. Patricia didn't appeal. Instead, she put her house up for sale. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she was moving to Arizona to live with her sister, leaving Columbus and Meadowbrook Hills behind. Part of me felt bad. She had lost her HOA position, her job, a lawsuit, and now was leaving her home. But the larger part of me remembered that night with the bolt cutters, remembered how close she had come to potentially killing my father, and I couldn't summon much sympathy. The day the moving truck came, I was helping Dad with his afternoon nebulizer treatment, the medical space heater humming contentedly in the corner of his room. Through the window, I watched Patricia's furniture being loaded up, her life packed into boxes and carried away. She never looked toward my house, never acknowledged the situation, just climbed into her Lexus and drove away. "Is that the HOA woman?" Dad asked, his voice muffled by the nebulizer mask. "Yeah," I said. "She's moving." "Good riddance," Dad said, and I had to agree. Life in Meadowbrook Hills improved dramatically after Patricia left. Doug proved to be an excellent HOA president, focused on actual community improvement rather than enforcement for its own sake. We repaved the community entrance road, updated the playground equipment, and organized neighborhood events that people actually wanted to attend. The Rules Committee I served on met quarterly, reviewing any proposed changes with an eye toward reasonableness and community benefit rather than control. I was at a committee meeting about a year after the whole Patricia situation when Linda Kowalski brought up something interesting. "I got a call from a reporter," she said. "Columbus Monthly is doing a story about HOA reform and wanted to interview us about the changes we've made here. They heard about what happened with Patricia and want to use it as an example of what not to do." The committee discussed it and agreed that publicity might help other communities avoid similar situations. I agreed to be interviewed, though I insisted my father's name be kept private for his privacy. The resulting article, "When HOAs Go Too Far: One Columbus Neighborhood's Fight for Common Sense," came out that fall and generated surprising interest. I received emails from people across the country dealing with their own HOA nightmares, asking for advice, thanking me for speaking out. One email stood out, from an attorney in Colorado who specialized in HOA law. "Your case is being used in legal seminars as an example of HOA overreach and violation of disability accommodation laws," she wrote. "Several states are considering legislation to rein in HOA authority based on cases like yours. You may not realize it, but you've helped a lot of people by standing your ground. I never set out to be an advocate for HOA reform. I just wanted to keep my father alive and healthy in our own home. But I realized that sometimes standing up to bullies, even ones armed with property covenants and board positions, was necessary. Patricia had counted on me backing down, on her authority intimidating me into compliance. When that didn't work, she escalated, and it cost her everything. Dad lived for another 3 years after the Patricia incident. His COPD eventually worsened despite the best medical care, and he passed away peacefully at home with me and his hospice nurse present. That medical space heater ran until his last day, maintaining the warm, humid environment his damaged lungs needed. I kept thinking about how different things might have been if Patricia had succeeded that night, if she had taken that equipment and Dad had gone into respiratory distress. After Dad passed, I considered selling the house and leaving Meadowbrook Hills, leaving the memories and the HOA drama behind. But the community had changed. It was a good place to live now, with reasonable rules and neighbors who looked out for each other rather than reporting each other for minor violations. I stayed, and I remained active in the HOA, helping ensure we never slid back into the kind of authoritarian enforcement that Patricia had championed. I ran into Patricia's attorney one day at a coffee shop in downtown Columbus. He recognized me and came over, looking slightly embarrassed. "Mr. Quinn," he said, "I wanted to apologize for that lawsuit. I advised my client against filing it, but she insisted. It was a waste of everyone's time and money." "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "Do you know how she's doing?" "I haven't heard from her since the case was dismissed," he said. "I assume she followed through on moving to Arizona. Between you and me, she needed help I couldn't provide. The HOA presidency became an obsession for her, and losing it broke something. I hope she's getting the support she needs." I thought about that conversation a lot afterward. Patricia had been a person, not just an antagonist in my story. Something in her life or personality had driven her to pursue power and control through the HOA, and when that was challenged, she couldn't handle it. I didn't excuse her actions. The danger she put my father in was real and inexcusable. But I could acknowledge that she was a human being who made terrible choices, and paid a high price for them. The medical space heater sat in my garage after Dad died, carefully packed away with his other medical equipment. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it, even though I no longer needed it. That device, a simple heating element with sensors and controls, had been at the center of one of the strangest, most stressful periods of my life. It represented my father's fragility, Patricia's overreach, and ultimately the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. 2 years after Dad's death, I was elected to the HOA board myself, taking over Linda's position when she moved to Florida. I brought Dad's old medical equipment to the first meeting I ran, setting the space heater on the table in front of me. "This is a reminder," I told the board and the residents in attendance. "A reminder that behind every property, every covenant, every rule, there are people living their lives. Real people with real problems and real needs. Our job as a board isn't to enforce rules for the sake of enforcement. It's to maintain our community in a way that helps everyone live their best lives. Sometimes that means enforcing standards, but it also means showing compassion, understanding, and common sense." Doug, who was still on the board as secretary, nodded. The Patricia Henderson situation should never happen again. Not here, not anywhere. We need to remember that our authority is limited and our purpose is service, not control. The board approved a new policy that night, requiring all medical equipment accommodations to be automatically approved upon submission of appropriate documentation, with no review or approval process that could delay necessary care. We also created a hardship exception process for residents facing temporary difficulties, whether medical, financial, or otherwise. The goal was to build community, not tear it down through aggressive enforcement. I kept Dad's medical space heater in my home office after that first meeting, sitting on a shelf where I could see it while I worked. It never heated another room, never saved another life, but it served as a constant reminder of why I stayed involved in the HOA. Why I spent my evenings at board meetings and my weekends reviewing covenant proposals. That small device represented the line between reasonable community governance and dangerous overreach, and I was determined to make sure Meadowbrook Hills stayed on the right side of that line. Years passed, and the Patricia Henderson situation became community legend, the cautionary tale that new board members heard during orientation. "Remember the heater incident," people would say when enforcement discussions got too aggressive. "Remember what happens when we forget that we're neighbors first and an HOA second." I eventually met someone, a woman named Melissa Lancaster, who moved into the community 3 years after Patricia left. She was a nurse at Riverside Methodist Hospital, and we bonded over medical stories and shared frustration with bureaucratic nonsense. When I told her about the Patricia situation on our 4th date, she was horrified. She tried to take medical equipment from a copped patient during a power outage. Melissa said her nurse instincts outraged. She could have killed him. Cold air exposure with severe copped, that's a recipe for respiratory failure. "I know," I said. "That's why I couldn't back down even when she showed up with bolt cutters." "Bolt cutters," Melissa's eyes widened. "This story just keeps getting worse." We married 2 years later in a ceremony held at the Meadowbrook Hills Clubhouse, the same building where I had confronted Patricia and the board all those years ago. Doug officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Half the neighborhood attended, and during the reception, Linda Kowalski, who flew in from Florida, raised a toast. "To Ethan," she said, "who taught us all that standing up to bullies matters, even when those bullies carry HOA covenants and think they're enforcing rules. You made this community better, and we're all grateful." The applause was genuine and warm, and I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't experienced since before Dad got sick, before Patricia's harassment, before everything got complicated. Meadowbrook Hills had become home again, not just a property I owned in a subdivision with rules, but a real community where neighbors cared about each other. On our first anniversary, Melissa and I learned we were expecting a baby. I thought a lot about Dad during Melissa's pregnancy, wishing he could meet his grandchild, wishing he could see how life had continued and improved after those difficult years. When our daughter was born, we named her Eleanor Marie Quinn, Eleanor after Melissa's grandmother and Marie after my mother. I set up Eleanor's nursery in what had been Dad's room, the room where the medical space heater had hummed for years, where he had breathed easier thanks to prescribed medical equipment, and a generator running through ice storms. I painted the walls a soft yellow, assembled a crib, and hung cheerful decorations. The room that had been defined by illness and medical necessity became a place of new life and possibility. The HOA sent a gift basket when Eleanor was born, a collection of baby supplies and a card signed by every board member and most of the neighborhood. "Welcome to Meadowbrook Hills, Eleanor," the card read. "May your home always be a place of safety, health, and happiness." That simple message captured everything I had fought for during the Patricia situation. Home should be safe. Medical needs should be accommodated without question. Community rules should help people, not hurt them. These weren't radical concepts, but they had required standing up to someone who saw authority as an end unto itself rather than a means to serve others. I never learned what happened to Patricia after she moved to Arizona. I didn't look her up on social media or ask mutual acquaintances for updates. That chapter was closed, and I had no desire to reopen it. I hope she found peace and perspective, that she learned from what happened and became a better person. But mainly, I just hope she stayed in Arizona and never tried to join another HOA board. Eleanor grew into a curious, energetic toddler who loved playing in our backyard and visiting the community playground. I watched her run around with other neighborhood kids, all of them oblivious to the history their parents knew, the battles fought over property covenants and medical equipment. That was how it should be, I thought. The next generation shouldn't inherit our conflicts. They should inherit the solutions we created, the more reasonable and compassionate community we built after learning hard lessons. On the 10th anniversary of the night Patricia showed up with bolt cutters, I was putting Eleanor to bed when she asked about the small space heater on the shelf in my office. "What's that, Daddy?" she asked, pointing at it during her good-night tour of the house. "That's something that belonged to your grandpa," I said, lifting her up so she could see it better. "It helped keep him healthy when he was sick." "Why do you keep it on a shelf?" "To remember," I said. "To remember that some things are more important than rules. Taking care of people we love, that's what really matters." Eleanor nodded seriously, her 3-year-old brain processing this in whatever way young children understand such things. "Can we say goodnight to Grandpa's heater?" "Sure," I said, and we did, a silly little ritual that somehow felt right. That night, lying in bed next to Melissa, I reflected on how a single space heater had changed the trajectory of my life. It had been the catalyst for confrontation with Patricia, which led to her removal from the HOA, which led to community reform, which led to my involvement in HOA governance, which led to meeting Melissa at a neighborhood event. One medical device, one winter power outage, one unreasonable HOA president, and everything had changed. "You're thinking about the heater again," Melissa said, recognizing my contemplative mood. "How did you know?" "You get a certain look, like you're somewhere else reliving it all." "Do you think I did the right thing?" I asked. Sometimes I wonder if I could have handled it differently, maybe avoided all the conflict. You protected your father, Melissa said firmly. That's always the right thing. Patricia made her choices. She chose to escalate. She chose to trespass. She chose to file that ridiculous lawsuit. You just defended your father's right to medical care in his own home. There's no universe where that's wrong. She was right, of course. I had spent years questioning my actions, wondering if I had been too aggressive in fighting back, if I had ruined Patricia's life over what she saw as legitimate HOA enforcement. But at the end of the day, she had threatened my father's health and safety. Everything that followed flowed from that initial choice she made to prioritize her interpretation of HOA rules over a man's medical needs. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA continued to thrive under reasonable leadership. Doug served as president for 4 years, before passing the role to a retired teacher named Sandra Mills, who brought the same common-sense approach to the position. I remained on the board, serving various roles as needed, always keeping that medical space heater in my office as a reminder of why I was there. We faced challenges, of course. Property disputes, financial decisions about community improvements, debates over new rules. But we handled them with dialogue and compromise, rather than authoritarian enforcement. When a family needed to build a wheelchair ramp that technically violated front yard modification rules, we approved it immediately and revised the rules to explicitly allow accessibility improvements. When a resident lost his job and fell behind on HOA dues, we worked out a payment plan instead of filing a lien. These were small acts of decency, but they mattered. The Columbus Monthly article about our HOA reforms led to speaking invitations. I found myself on panels at community planning conferences, telling the story of Patricia and the space heater, explaining how we had rebuilt a healthier HOA culture. Other communities reached out for advice, asking how to rein in overzealous boards or reform oppressive covenants. I helped where I could, sharing our revised covenant templates and governance procedures. One woman from a subdivision in Cleveland sent me a particularly moving email. "My mother has dementia and needs special door alarms to prevent wandering," she wrote. Our HOA said the alarms were unauthorized exterior modifications and demanded we remove them. After reading your story, I stood up to them and filed an ADA complaint. They backed down immediately. Thank you for showing me that HOA rules don't have to be absolute. These messages reminded me that the fight with Patricia, as stressful and unpleasant as it had been, had served a larger purpose. By refusing to back down, by documenting everything and pursuing legal remedies, I had created a roadmap others could follow. That was worth something. Eleanor started kindergarten at the local public school, where several other Meadowbrook Hills kids attended. At the parent orientation, I met other HOA board members from our community, all of us bonding over the shared experience of trying to raise kids while maintaining a subdivision. The conversation inevitably turned to HOA business, and one newer resident asked about the famous space heater incident she had heard referenced at board meetings. I told the story again, condensed for a general audience, and watched her face go from skeptical to horrified as I described Patricia's escalation. "And you won the lawsuit?" she asked. "The case was dismissed with prejudice, and she had to pay my attorney fees," I confirmed. "But more importantly, we reformed our governance to make sure it couldn't happen again." "That's incredible," she said. "Our last HOA in Michigan was terrible. Fines for everything, no common sense at all. This neighborhood is so different. Now I understand why." That was the legacy I wanted, not the dramatic confrontation with Patricia, but the lasting change that came from it. Future residents wouldn't know about bolt cutters or restraining orders. They would just know that Meadowbrook Hills was a reasonable place to live, where rules existed to maintain the community rather than control the residents. As Alina grew older and I had more time, I expanded my HOA reform advocacy work. I started a blog sharing advice for residents dealing with overzealous HOAs, explaining legal protections like the Fair Housing Act and ADA, offering templates for formal complaints and accommodation requests. The blog developed a small but dedicated following, people who had been bullied by their HOAs and were looking for ways to fight back. One post, "Medical Accommodations, Know Your Rights," became particularly popular, shared across social media and HOA discussion forums. I detailed the legal framework protecting medical equipment, the limits of HOA authority, and steps to take if an HOA tried to interfere with necessary medical devices. At the end, I told the full story of Patricia and the space heater, holding nothing back. The comments section filled with similar stories. People whose HOAs had tried to ban wheelchair ramps, remove medically necessary handrails, prohibit service animals, or eliminate accessible parking spaces. Each story made me angry all over again, the same anger I had felt watching Patricia with those bolt cutters. How did people with a tiny amount of authority become so convinced of their righteousness that they would endanger disabled residents? Through the blog, I connected with attorneys across the country who specialized in HOA law. We shared information about cases, successful strategies, and new legislation. Several states had passed laws limiting HOA authority over medical accommodations, explicitly protecting residents' rights to necessary equipment and modifications. It was slow progress, but it was progress. Melissa sometimes joked that the space heater had become my cause, the hill I was willing to die on. She wasn't wrong. Every time I heard about an HOA targeting a disabled resident, I felt compelled to help, to share information, to connect them with resources. It became a second job, unpaid but deeply satisfying, knowing I was preventing other families from going through what Dad and I had experienced. Lena was 7 when we had to explain to her why some news reporters wanted to interview Daddy about a space heater. A local TV station was doing a consumer protection segment on HOA disputes and wanted to feature our story. Melissa and I discussed whether to participate, whether dredging up the past again was worth it, but ultimately decided that raising awareness could help others. The segment aired on a Tuesday evening. A 6-minute piece that interviewed me, showed footage of the community, included clips from the restraining order hearing, and featured commentary from Robert Chen about HOA legal overreach. The reporters had even tracked down Officer Davis, who was now retired, and he confirmed the details of Patricia's trespassing incident. In 25 years of law enforcement, that was one of the strangest calls I responded to, Officer Davis said on camera. An HOA president with bolt cutters trying to steal medical equipment. You can't make that stuff up. The segment went viral online, shared millions of times, spawning discussions about HOA reform and homeowner rights. My email inbox exploded with messages, some supportive, some critical, accusing me of destroying Patricia's life over a misunderstanding. I ignored the critical ones. They hadn't been there that night, hadn't seen the bolt cutters, hadn't understood the danger to my father's life. Patricia's sister reached out through a Facebook message 3 days after the segment aired. "I'm Deanne Henderson, Patricia's sister," the message read. "I want you to know that Patricia deeply regrets what happened." She's been in therapy for years, working through control issues and anxiety that manifested in her HOA involvement. She's not the monster you portrayed on TV. She's a person who made mistakes and has suffered greatly for them. Please consider the impact of continuing to publicize this story. I stared at that message for a long time before responding. Part of me felt sympathy. Melissa had been right all those years ago that Patricia clearly had deeper issues. But another part of me remembered that night, the cold, the fear, the very real danger to my father. I wrote back carefully. I appreciate you reaching out, and I'm glad Patricia is getting help. I never intended to portray her as a monster, only to document what actually happened. The story continues to resonate because HOA overreach is a widespread problem that affects many people. If Patricia has truly changed and found peace, I'm genuinely happy for her. But I won't stop talking about what happened because it helps others understand their rights and protects vulnerable residents from similar situations. Diane never responded, and I didn't expect her to. I had said what needed to be said, acknowledging Patricia's humanity while refusing to bury a story that had educational value. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but real life rarely offered those. The years continued to pass. Alina grew into a bright, socially conscious teenager who decided to do her 8th grade civics project on HOA governance and resident rights. She interviewed me extensively, reviewed all my documentation from the Patricia situation, and created a presentation arguing for stronger state-level regulation of HOA authority. Did you know that HOAs can foreclose on houses for unpaid fees in some states? She asked me while working on her project. Like, people lose their homes over a few $100s. That's insane. It is, I agreed. That's why reform is important. HOAs serve a purpose, but they need oversight and limitations just like any organization with power over people's lives. Alina's project won first place at her school and advanced to the regional competition, where she presented to an audience that included state legislators. One of them, Representative Maria Gonzalez, approached us afterward and asked if I'd be willing to testify before a committee considering HOA reform legislation in Ohio. I testified 3 months later, once again telling the story of Patricia and the space heater, but this time in the Ohio State House, speaking to elected officials who could actually change the laws. The proposed legislation would explicitly protect medical accommodations, create an appeals process for HOA disputes, and limit the fees and penalties HOAs could impose. HOAs were created to maintain property values and community standards, I told the committee. But too often, they become instruments of harassment and control. My father nearly lost access to life-saving medical equipment because an HOA president decided her interpretation of fire safety rules outweighed a doctor's prescription. This should never happen. The law should clearly protect residents' rights to necessary medical devices and reasonable accommodations. The legislation passed 6 months later, signed into law by the governor with Representative Gonzalez and me standing behind him for the photo opportunity. It wasn't everything I hoped for, but it was real progress, legal protections that would help future Ohio residents avoid what my father and I had endured. That night, I stood in my office looking at Dad's medical space heater on its shelf, the device that had started everything. It had been over 15 years since that ice storm, since Patricia's midnight visit with bolt cutters, since the beginning of a journey I never expected to take. One small heater had led to HOA reform in my community, legal victories, advocacy work, media attention, and now state legislation. The ripple effects continued spreading, touching lives I would never meet, protecting people I would never know. "Thank you," I said quietly to the heater, which was ridiculous because it was an inanimate object. But somehow it felt right, honoring the role it had played, the lives it had protected both directly through its medical function and indirectly through the reforms it inspired. Melissa found me there and wrapped her arms around me. "Proud of you," she said simply. "I just told the truth," I said. "Patricia did the rest. You stood up when it would have been easier to back down. That matters." She was right. In that moment during the power outage, when Patricia first demanded I surrender the space heater, I could have complied. It would have been easier, would have avoided all the conflict and stress. But it also would have endangered my father and established the precedent that HOA authority trumped medical necessity. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was difficult and messy. The medical space heater remained on my office shelf, a permanent fixture, a reminder, a symbol. When I had difficult decisions to make, whether about HOA governance or family matters or ethical questions, I looked at it and remembered what it represented: choosing people over rules, choosing compassion over control, choosing to stand up even when it was hard. That small device, designed to keep a sick old man warm and breathing, had taught me lessons that extended far beyond its simple function. And that, ultimately, was the real story, not just about an HOA gone wrong, but about finding the courage to resist unreasonable authority, about the unexpected ways that standing up for what's right can create lasting change, and about how the things we fight for define us more than the things we accept.